So yeah, thanks a lot for this very friendly introduction and for the invitation to join your retreat. I already enjoyed a lot the last day, the sessions as well as the conversations in the coffee and lunch corners. And I hope indeed that my talk might add or link up, at some percent, link up with discussions we had yesterday on one, as Robin just said, relating to questions of, let's say, what could be practices fostering responsible research and innovation, but also questions around the role of promise in research and innovation. And those who might have attended the ASSIST conference in 21 might also recognize the general concern which is in this talk, because that was a kind of line of thinking I started then, although Robin said so many, and as it was online, it's hard to recognize who was there at the time. Today, I want to dig somewhat, delve a bit deeper in this topic. On the one hand, digging a bit deeper in what I think might be interesting conceptual resources for this. And secondly, looking into a particular, if you like, newly established practice by the Dutch Research Council as an obligatory element in large parts of their funding programs, and will question to what extent this might be seen as a sort of practice-based approach, and whether one might assume that this has some potential for, as one would say, modulating common promissory dynamics, which we typically see in research and innovation, or fostering maybe some responsible aspects of anticipation in the governance of research and innovation. So maybe outline quickly once more, what are the kind of research lines I'm linking up with here, or which are behind this? So on the one hand, indeed, the quite extensive work on sociotechnical futures in research and innovation there, and also, as Robin already mentioned it, in sociology of expectations as one of the fields where me and many others have, for instance, looked into the role of expectations, promises, partly also concerns, and their performative role in research innovation. But where a lot of work is indeed also criticizing again and again, overly optimistic promises, which might lead to high dynamics, or that have also been criticized for, let's say, a lack of understanding, or maybe sometimes also simply a strategic underestimation of a social complexity involved in bringing any of these promises maybe to reality. So here there is a view which often problematizes a certain, if you like, certain overflow of anticipation. Whereas, of course, there's lots of work which is rather addressing anticipation as something positive, as something to be fostered, as is obvious in strands like that more focus on foresight, anticipation, or anticipatory governance. Also in responsible innovation, as you were for sure very familiar with, anticipation is one of the important pillars or dimensions. Also here, not claiming that anticipation in each and every form thing, but also stressing that the more improved forms of anticipation, particularly of societal impact, would be needed, and a lot of RI tools have been developed over the years which aim, among other things, also at that. So the point is, there seems to be a sort of tension, or for someone like me who has been working with different fields, it's also kind of continuous uneasiness, asking which forms of anticipation are actually useful. Probably not anyone. There can also be kind of too much of it. A bit broader question would be, but I'm not going into this today, to what extent, what are situations where maybe ever more futuring is anyway not the most productive way forward. Sometimes less is more. But for today, kind of like the key guiding questions are, well, I will also say something what I think could be characteristics or what might be needed for anticipation to be considered responsible. Surely context dependent, but some things might. And then this question, which is also in the title, so how can responsible forms of anticipation be fostered in research innovation and governance, in the sense that it's also something which is not just one-off exercise somewhere, but that it becomes an integrated part in how it's, let's say, embedded in common structures here. Again, there are also certain strands of literature who work very much with these notions of responsible innovation or, responsible anticipation, or I see now also our design colleagues, responsible futuring, so it seems to be quite around. I'm here particularly interested, as I said, on the one hand with relating to this tendency of overpromising and to what extent that might be modulated, but also how this might show certain characteristics, otherwise which one would relate to here, and how this might be supported by practices and particular processes. I will firstly, I hope it's not going to be too dry, explain a little bit the sort of conceptual frameworks I find useful here. So in particular, the suggestion to look at the anticipatory practices which are contributing to circulation and use of some form of expectations, visions, and so forth. Then I also positioning this a little bit in the broader research on science, on futures in science technology studies, why this, and provide a sort of mini review of literatures who have worked with concepts like anticipatory practices, but also anticipatory regimes or assemblage, and then suggest that it might be useful to turn around a little bit the perspective from considering mostly anticipatory practice as an element in innovation and technical change, but to consider to what extent the kind of repertoires we have developed within science, technology, innovation studies in thinking about change and about innovation might also be useful to think about change in such anticipatory practices. And then, after giving some further directions how this could be used, look into this new practice, the so-called impact plan approach, which has been introduced by the Dutch funding agency. Explain why I think that can be described as a kind of a little bit practice-based approach. Also compare it to very similar approaches used by other funding organizations like Horizon Europe. But I think if you look at it a bit more closely, you see some subtle but potentially relevant differences. And then close with a kind of, once more asking from an innovation lens, what are we seeing here actually? So why anticipatory practices? As a possibly good starting point, or as Ari would have said, maybe a locus for modulating or changing the role of anticipation in innovation. Now, in SDS researchers, of course, I already mentioned it, sociology of expectation, which looks often also in expectations as part of discourses, how they change, what are their performative roles. I would consider this more as a meso level because usually concerned with collective expectations, addressing expectations relating to certain innovation or research fields. There's, of course, a lot of work which takes a more engaged and interventionist approach, which I would, not all, but generally more micro-oriented because it's often related to certain projects, so not something which is element of common structures. If so, then I think we turn it to an anticipatory practice. There's also lots of very interesting work which is more addressing starting from macro perspective, for instance, considering how modes of future orientation, to what extent actually refers to the future or in which ways, that might change from culture to culture or have changed historically, or also work, for instance, by Pierre-Benoît Joly and colleagues who are more identifying certain globalized almost regimes of promising which are considered as characteristic for general modes of dominant modes of innovation. Now, by looking at anticipatory practices, I think is an interesting in-between level because on the one hand it refers to practices which are somewhat established and in that sense or common in a certain field, should have a little bit more scope for change compared to doing a one-time exercise, but on the other hand are maybe a little bit more amenable to change rather than trying to, let's say, overhaul completely the indeed rather entrenched innovation regimes which also create these incentives for promising and over-promising. Maybe also to say something, if I'm speaking about anticipatory practices, I refer on the one hand to many, let's say, dedicated forms, practices which are per se meant to explore futures. That might be in the form of modeling, that might be in the form of sociotechnical scenarios, that might be in the form of all kinds of road mapping exercises, what have you, which are typically rather common. That's the way how one does it in a certain field. But also more implicit forms. So for instance, in a study which we did on following the various anticipatory practices which have contributed to the emergence of hype in graphene, that also involves, let's say, the editorial and publishing practices of, for example, leading journals like Science or Nature, who have an impact, and many more. So, now, if one uses, maybe as a difference from the very useful and often used perspectives, starting more from a discourse, so expectations as you find them there, with a view on practices, the perspective shifts to looking at the, let's say, underlying social material practices which are contributing, as just said, to the production of expectations, but also their circulation or their use of any sorts of anticipatory statements. Various researchers have also suggested that it's useful to work with concepts like anticipatory assemblage or regimes, in the sense that these would then not focus on only one particular practice, but for instance, as an assemblage, a combination of practices, pay attention how such a practice is related to the underlying material artifacts. So take something like modeling, which has been often studied in that field. Software, hardware, and how this might change over time. Of course, the kind of underlying understandings, discourses, which are in line with certain ways of, for instance, doing modeling or doing road mapping or any other practice. Which kind of actors are involved in this or not? How do they relate? And in which form, if ever, these are institutionalized? These terms are sometimes used by some more as stressing and then stressing the, let's say, anticipatory in regimes. So then stressing that there's this kind of general future orientation or up to preoccupation with the future as a general feature of our times. There's others, and that's also more the way how I would use them, use it more stressing the regime term here. So being interested in the different and specific ways how practices might differ from field to field. So for instance, what have been the particular ways of modeling and their underlying understandings of relations between, for instance, energy and economic development? In modeling for energy policy, how has this changed over time and how has this enabled different forms of policy? Interesting study by Stefan Eickhout, for instance. Similar distinction you see if in the fields which consider particular practices in research and innovation. So referring either to these more global regimes of promising, as Julie and others did, or looking more in, some also called it micro-regimes, so stressing that behind different ways, for example, modeling related to forest research and management, different ways of modeling relate, for example, to different ways of managing this. What is rather common to this very interesting field of research, that it, as many STS works, largely takes a, let's say, critical descriptive perspective. So analyzing the role of these different practices and so forth. There is, with some exceptions, less attention to change or purposeful change here. The study about changes in energy modeling and policy would be one of these exceptions. Which I think, or another study who looked how it was kind of as a sort of innovation, a new way of risk calculation in general regulated risk assessment methods. So what I would like to suggest that it could be interesting, as I said, to turn this perspective a little bit around and think about to what extent our common repertoires of thinking about change and innovation could be useful here. And Probably you can draw on many things, but for the moment I would try the most obvious one. So how is change thought about in relation to social practices in SDS research, or drawing on some of these more regime and transition thinking. So commonly, change in social practices, one would look either on how certain elements of such a practice change. So for instance, if there are new materials and tools introduced, changes in competences which are needed from that, or the underlying meanings or social norms, if one practice is substituted by another, or maybe if you just see a rearrangement in how different practices relate, or how maybe practices relate to decision making. Probably that should work relatively well for practices which are anyway rather technology heavy, because many of these concepts have been developed here in relation to more innovations, at least involving technologies. And there are sufficient of these practices like modeling a project, the whole algorithmic prediction, risk calculations, and so forth. However, as I said, I think in principle that should also work with the more informal and less dedicated forms, as I mentioned, publishing, editorial practices, practices of research and evaluation, hype assessment, and so forth. I think it's also important to consider probably to what extent certain professional cultures shape such practices and their underlying thinkings. For instance, the sort of almost, I would say, promissory reflexes, which in certain also innovation and engineering cultures are there once you start talking about your new technologies, or what is typically typical blind spots, or certain, I would say, almost cultural attitude to try to rather ignore and underestimate uncertainties. Well, from more like regime thinking, one can of course ask, do we see some kind of niche regime dynamics? Again, that might hold, I think, as you've seen with other transitions research, for some empirical fields, you have rather strongly established practices, as for instance in assessment practice required in regulation, for instance. But we should also expect to see quite some, well, the common developments of experimentation, learning, institutionalization processes, and so forth, up to expectations of what are considered the most promising anticipatory practices at some time. For instance, AI-based predictions might be one thing. So how could this be employed? I think in many, probably as many directions as for anticipatory practices. I myself used this a little bit to look into, and that was something which I think presented at ASSIST, looking into the various road mapping practices of all sorts, which are, I would say, somewhat proliferating at the nexus of science policy and industry, in particular when it comes to negotiating new funding programs. Or, as I mentioned before, when studying the different practices which have been contributing to how expectations up to a hype emerge in a particular field as graphene, and what kind of governance effects they have for organizing also such a field, and how these practices change over time. And then the example which I would like to go in now, that is practices as an element in the regular funding process. Now, NWO, the Dutch National Research Council, has introduced this kind of practice about, or maybe first of all start on what the basis here is. So also maybe to stress that this is not a fully fledged research project, something which I, well, also triggered by my own experiences. I'm also submitting proposals and have to go through these processes and practices, but on publicly available material, as well as on conversations and interviews with NW officers occupied with this field. Also, as I said, what would I actually consider as characteristics of innovation? One could probably spend a whole talk on this, but mentioning some things Many of these probably not too surprising. So I would say such anticipation should be clearly reflexive of a sort of, and also explicit, transparent, the sort of uncertainties which are involved with any future claims, directions, visions, rather than coming up with a rather common forms of over-assertiveness. Generally be transparent about the kind of knowledge it is based on. It should avoid inflated claims. Well, any constructively minded thinker would now say, but you will know this only by hindsight. Yes, here I'm referring to claims which are being made where the person who's voicing them is already, or is at the moment this is being done, considers this as slightly over the top themselves. It should be reflexive of a kind of sociotechnical or any other real-world dynamics which might be implied or needed, required for realizing any of these expectations, visions, promises. Being inclusive, so a relatively broad basis of knowledge. And that is something which came out more in a study which we did on also German policy related to fuel cells and hydrogen over the years. It should be tentative, by which I mean, on the one hand, open, adaptive to be changed over time, because mostly things develop differently than anticipated at a certain moment in time. But that should also be balanced with a certain element of robustness, meaning else you might easily just hop from one collective expectation hype to another. So what exactly this good balance is in the field, that might be somewhat context dependent. But that's maybe a bit of a qualifier to also general call for openness in anticipation, which is mostly good and mostly the thing which is rather needed. But there might also be situations when you rather have a proliferation of very many and anticipations, and then some consolidation might be useful as well. Now, as I said, so this practice called impact plan approach has been introduced about 2 years ago. It had been used before in a, if you like, more niche program directed at supporting research in, for developmental programs. So you could say a certain development from niche to becoming an element in the regular, at least Dutch funding regime, if you like. Key point about being that it shifts a bit the focus from asking for a sort of paragraph on societal impact as part of any project which is aimed at creating some societal impact. For projects who are more fundamental, a bit of a different, more open approach is being used. But not just coming up with any sort of impact paragraph, which most also of our technical colleagues are often very much struggling with, what else they could do and come up with a kind of general promise. So to explicate in a kind of step-by-step way, what would be the pathway, a certain desired impact from results of a project via various intermediate steps to what in the end is being aimed for, to reflect and explicate what kind of change process would be involved, and change processes in a broader sense, so not just a technology which should be adopted, diffused, and everything is done. What are the underlying assumptions, also kind of implicit assumptions, what stakeholders would have to be involved, and what should be possible risks. Now I could imagine that many of you who are involved in various funding might recognize of these things. For example, Horizon Europe uses a very similar approach, at least at first sight. As I said, I will go into this hopefully later on. But what I find is somewhat specific here, that it actually works with a number of what I would call practice elements. So it provides, typically, if maybe something to be mentioned in the Netherlands, if you want to submit something to NVO, mostly you have to register in advance. So it's rather difficult to submit something before going through some NVO obligatory passage points. Among those, for example, participating in such workshops that can be live, can be online. There's also material for self-study, including videos and what have you, theory behind it, worksheets, in how to work towards such an impact plan. Also rather explicit with regards to meaning, that they would follow a certain understanding of innovation as complex, complex, interactive, dynamic, co-creative processes. Well, as SCIS researchers, happy to hear this maybe. And that one should please work with a broad concept of change, which is not just technology, but social change, business models, well, what have you. Also considering that this is, well, this requires a certain building up of competences, will be a learning process, and it requires learning processes not only on the side of the researchers, but also reviewers and committees. So in that sense, for this to be working, one needs to surely think about as a sort of bundle of practices. So it's about proposal writing, but it has to somehow align with reviewers' practices, or also how project management then goes along, or the evaluation of projects. Definitely it's a form of an institutionalized practice, as it's a binding element in large parts of research programs now. Well, as we said, not mentioned as a simple recipe. And it follows a, I would say, tentative adaptive approach. As it's said, well, indeed, the idea is not that at the end of a project to check if you are fully on track on what you started in the beginning, but the idea is that you would have half-yearly meetings with the consortium, with some NWO for reconsidering, if necessary, revising your ideas about creating impact. So it was stressed, it's not the idea if you don't do this, your project is considered as failed. It's fine if you have good reasons to maybe have changed over time. Expected impacts from the side of NWO is that well, it's seen as a framework or tools which should in particular help the thinking process in the proposal phase or later on, and the communication, because indeed also there, typically consortia have to be interdisciplinary, have to involve non-academic partners, which you can expect to come up with rather different basic assumptions, frameworks, worldviews. It should in that sense also lead to better consortia. Better understanding who needs to be involved then. And with regard to this question of over-promising, it should lead to reasonable and logical claims, so no over-promising, but also being stressed, also not too small, maybe too technical claims. So again, probably depends on where somebody starts, if it should rather being forced to think through a bit more the way to realizing a certain impact might tone things down or opens up maybe some new horizons. Should also help the project as research is done by also having them think on the kind of questions and being formulated or the methodology being used. And it should help reviewers on evaluating these societal impact parts by giving more structure to it. Experience so far as the first projects have started maybe 1.5 year ago, of course, very preliminary. And therefore also no evaluations have been made so far. Seemingly some improvements of these impact plans is visible. Seemingly the consortia in terms of inter- and transdisciplinarity are getting better. Seemingly younger researchers cope better with this than the older generation. Well, I wouldn't be so surprised because we're just exposed much longer to that kind of thinking and approaches. So I think it's a bit too early to see, but it's, I think this impact this impact plan will very much depend on all the things already mentioned, but also to what extent it aligns maybe with practices and thinking in our funding projects. So if it has something which people at some more internalize as a way of doing, or also how this aligns or disaligns with developments in the, let's say, various disciplinary knowledge cultures. As I said, at first sight, that doesn't look very different than what you see, for instance, also in Horizon Europe. NVO person also said that UK seems to have approach, while according to him not with kind of practice underpinnings. I don't know, you might tell me more about that. But starting with Horizon Europe, so if you look the kind of terms being used in the impact section there, it's almost identical. I mean, if you say results or output of a project, doesn't matter much. However, if you look at the, and here it's useful to look at the kind of explanation which comes with any of these proposal templates, how this is to be understood and used. That, for example, the required specification in the case of Europe is quite high, also stressing a narrative they want all. But to come up with quantification whenever possible, I would say NVO, you might do this, but it's more moderate narrative plus some form of indicators, which can also be more qualitative. Interesting is the understanding of assumptions. So there is on the Horizon Europe side, this is understood more as an underpinning of explicit assumptions. For instance, with based on studies and statistics, it's being said. Fine, you should corroborate them. Whereas on the side of NVO, it's more about, as I said, with explication also of implicit assumptions on, for instance, cause-effect relationships, underlying such theories of change, for instance, paradigms and worldviews of partners, context or belief systems. As I said, the kind of support for the proposal process on the one hand is, as I would say, rather detailed, practice-based. Horizon Europe, it's not fully clear. There are so many grant offices in the world and organizations and consultancies, so there's probably a diversity, I would assume. I can't say much about the reviewing process. As for the project course and evaluation, in the EU proposal you still see these common, okay, define things up front as milestones, deliverables, and so forth, which are being used in the review process, which are more rigid. Again, always how you live them, but that's also how I would have experienced them. On the NVO side, as you said, that's more seen as a kind of continuous re-evaluation, revision, and I've never been asked about milestones and deliverables from NWO in my project so far. So in that sense, I think one could say very similar at the first sight, but the Dutch version seems to be a bit more reflexive and tentative. So if we want to sort of reinterpret once more what this from a kind of innovation or tentative governance lens, I think what one can see here is still hypothetical, but it is an anticipatory practice which is moving from what one might see kind of niche to more regime or mainstream level. Indeed, a direction of a new practice which follows such a practice approach based on tools, competences, frameworks. There's also some, but that's purely anecdotal indications that also in other places like our university here, oh, we're taking this up. So let's see what this means. One can, of course, ask, and once you start talking about a niche and regimes, you would ask, well, is it really a niche in terms of radical change? I think this approach, not necessarily. That's what I would rather see as a kind of modulation of practices, but still, I mean, it's not a radical change in how project money is being distributed. You still have proposals, a selection from the and so forth. I would also say, I think, and that's interesting, I think the more you go to the level where money is being distributed, in particular upfront when there's a decision about which fields should receive money, then I think you see still much more this kind of common promissory dynamics at work. Interestingly, NWO is currently also experimenting, that's also the very word, with, I think, indeed more radical ways of distributing or organizing programs differently. So for instance, in really big programs, one for instance currently on hydrogen, the approach is not that you have a call to which various different consortia can apply with, but the approach is that any organization, so for instance our university, who is interested to participate, can send in or apply for one representative organization to participate in such a sandwich, and then all those interested have to organize themselves and come up with one proposal to be endorsed, which very much, I think, shifts the process and also the kind of where the competitive dynamics and so forth come in. That, I think, is really a bit more, more radical forms of experiments, and probably also still more tentative if this is a viable way forward. Okay, so to come to an end, and so mainly summarizing once more my key points. So my suggestion would be that studying such institutionally or culturally embedded anticipatory practices, be they more formalized, dedicated, or more informal ones, which you might not even recognize at first sight that this is actually contributing to expectation building, to study this as a starting point for maybe, first of all, understanding, but possibly also modulating common promissory or maybe any other anticipatory dynamics one might be interested in. That it might be worthwhile to add to this already existing literature a bit more of attention to change processes here, and maybe also how one can try to change practices which are considered problematic. That the kind of repertoire of understandings which we have developed in science, technology, innovation studies might be useful here. And I think I only scratched on that. Yeah, and I think further work might probably also need to look also in various more specific settings, what kind of practices might be appropriate, useful, productive, responsible in particular settings. I think that was it. I hope it wasn't too long.